There's a moment worth picturing precisely because it captures the entire subject of this exploration in a single image. A narcissist has just deployed something that has worked reliably for years on countless other people. A specific comment, a specific tactic, a specific pressure point they've learned to press with practiced precision. And it lands on someone who simply doesn't move. Not because they're pretending not to be affected, not because they're gritting their teeth through discomfort, but because the thing being pressed on genuinely isn't there to press on anymore. And in that exact moment, something considerably more interesting than failure happens. Confusion does. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to name the one thing precisely, because it's easy to imagine this title promising something vague or mystical. It isn't vague at all. The one thing a narcissist cannot control in a genuinely authentic person is their internal locus of self-worth, the actual physical location, so to speak, where their sense of being valuable, being enough, being real gets generated and maintained. In most people, this location has at least some external wiring, some dependency on outside approval, outside comparison, outside confirmation. In someone genuinely authentic, this location has become internally sourced enough that external manipulation simply has nowhere left to plug in. Let's start by understanding why this specific thing, out of everything else a narcissist might try to control, remains genuinely, structurally uncontrollable, because this distinction matters enormously. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic control actually operates. It doesn't operate through direct force in most cases. It operates through leverage, finding a lever already present inside you, insecurity, guilt-proneness, fear of disappointing someone, hunger for approval, and then applying pressure to that existing lever until it produces the desired movement. This is worth understanding as the actual mechanism underneath nearly every tactic this entire series has traced, from guilt-tripping to manufactured vulnerability to comparison. None of these tactics create the vulnerability they exploit. They locate it, already present, and press on it. Here's what this means for authentic people specifically, and it's worth stating with real precision. If someone's sense of worth has become genuinely internally generated, stable, regardless of whether any specific person currently approves of them, the lever these tactics depend on simply isn't there in the same accessible way. This isn't because authentic people are somehow immune to caring what others think, and it's worth correcting that misconception directly, because authentic people do care, genuinely, about the people they love and respect. What's different is that this care doesn't function as a control point, because their fundamental sense of being worthy doesn't rise or fall based on whether that care is currently being reciprocated or validated in any given moment. Let's talk about what this actually looks like when a narcissist encounters it directly, because the confusion this produces is worth examining specifically. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology depends on reading and responding to reaction, using someone's visible discomfort, visible need for approval, or visible fear of disappointing them as the raw material for continued influence. When a genuinely authentic person doesn't supply this raw material, not through suppression, but because it genuinely isn't being generated in the first place, the narcissist encounters something they have very limited tools for handling: a genuine absence of leverage, rather than simply resistance to leverage that's still technically present and waiting to be pressed harder. This distinction between absence and resistance matters enormously, and it's worth understanding precisely why. Resistance, however skilled, still implies the vulnerability exists underneath, simply being managed or controlled through effort. A narcissist encountering resistance often escalates, testing whether enough pressure will eventually overcome the resistance and access the vulnerability presumed to be there. This is exactly what we've traced throughout other explorations in this series regarding escalation following unsuccessful manipulation attempts. But genuine absence produces something different. There's no vulnerability to eventually access through escalation because it was never simply being managed. It genuinely isn't present in the way the narcissist's entire strategy assumes it must be. Let's talk about a specific illustrative scenario, because it's worth grounding this in something concrete rather than leaving it abstract. Picture a narcissist attempting the classic comparison tactic we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series, measuring an authentic person against someone else specifically to produce insecurity and anxious effort to prove worth. In someone whose sense of worth carries genuine external dependency, this tactic often produces exactly its intended effect: a scramble to compete, to prove, to close whatever gap has just been implied. In a genuinely authentic person, something considerably different happens. The comparison simply doesn't activate anything requiring response, because their sense of worth was never actually positioned relative to anyone else's in the first place. It exists on its own terms, independent of comparison entirely. This is worth understanding as genuinely disorienting for the narcissist attempting this tactic, because their entire model for how this interaction should unfold: comparison produces insecurity, insecurity produces anxious compliance, simply doesn't execute. The model fails, not because the target fought back successfully, but because the model's basic assumption that comparison would find something to activate turned out to be inaccurate. What we haven't yet explored is why this specific kind of failure produces such a strong, often visible reaction in narcissistic psychology, why it tends to be experienced as considerably more threatening than ordinary defiance or resistance, and what this reveals about the deeper structure underneath narcissistic control more broadly, which is exactly where we need to go next. Let's talk about why this specific kind of failure, encountering genuine absence rather than resistance, produces such a strong reaction in narcissistic psychology, because understanding this explains something we've touched on throughout other explorations in this entire series, but haven't yet fully connected to this specific mechanism. Here's what's worth understanding precisely. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what narcissistic psychology actually needs from other people: not simply compliance in any given moment, but ongoing confirmation that their tactics work, that their read of other people remains accurate, that their fundamental model of how influence and control operate continues to function reliably. Every successful manipulation, every time a lever gets found and pressed and produces the expected movement, reinforces this model, confirming that the world operates the way this psychology needs it to operate in order to feel stable and predictable. When an authentic person's genuine absence of external dependency breaks this model, something considerably more significant than a single failed tactic occurs. The failure doesn't stay contained to this one interaction. It introduces genuine uncertainty into the broader model itself, a model that has, until this point, generally proven reliable enough across other relationships to feel like an accurate, trustworthy map of how people actually work. This is worth understanding as the actual source of the disproportionate reaction this specific encounter tends to produce. It isn't simply that one tactic failed. It's that the failure suggests something the entire structure has enormous investment in not being true, that their read of people, their fundamental strategy for extracting the validation and control they depend on, might not actually be as universally reliable as they've needed it to be. Let's talk about a specific pattern worth recognizing directly, one that tends to follow this exact kind of encounter: intensified, often increasingly desperate attempts to locate some lever, any lever, that might actually work. This is worth understanding as genuinely revealing, because it demonstrates something important about the underlying mechanism we've traced throughout this entire series. Rather than accepting the absence of leverage and adjusting their approach accordingly, narcissistic psychology often responds to this specific kind of failure by escalating the search itself, trying increasingly varied tactics: guilt, charm, criticism, sudden vulnerability, comparison, in rapid succession, searching almost frantically for whatever specific pressure point might finally produce the expected result. This escalating search is worth recognizing as itself a form of confirmation, revealing through its very intensity and variety just how genuinely destabilizing the absence of any working leverage has become. A narcissist who has successfully located leverage in someone rarely needs to cycle through this many different tactics in rapid succession, because the first or second attempt has already produced what they needed. The presence of this rapid, varied cycling is worth understanding as direct evidence that the genuine absence we've traced throughout this exploration has actually been encountered, rather than simply resistance that eventually might have yielded to sufficient pressure. Let's talk about something worth naming directly here, because it addresses a common and understandable question. Does this mean authentic people never experience any effect at all from narcissistic tactics, some kind of complete permanent immunity? This deserves an honest, precise answer, because overstating this would be inaccurate and would set an unrealistic standard for anyone working to build this kind of authenticity themselves. Authentic people aren't immune to noticing manipulation attempts, and they're not immune to occasional moments of genuine hurt or genuine frustration when someone they care about behaves badly toward them. What differs specifically is the absence of the particular vulnerability these tactics are designed to exploit. Insecurity about fundamental worth, dependency on this specific person's approval for basic self-regard, fear that disappointing them threatens something essential about identity. Authentic people can feel hurt by unkindness, without that hurt cascading into the kind of destabilization these tactics are actually designed to produce. This distinction matters enormously for anyone working to build this kind of authenticity themselves, because it removes an unrealistic, unhelpful standard, complete emotional invulnerability, and replaces it with something considerably more achievable and considerably more accurate: genuine stability in your fundamental sense of worth, alongside continued, entirely normal capacity to feel things, including occasional hurt, without that hurt threatening the actual foundation everything else rests on. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what actually builds this specific kind of internally sourced worth, if it doesn't already exist. Why this particular quality represents the single most valuable, most protective thing available against narcissistic influence, considerably more valuable than any specific tactic or boundary this entire series has traced, and what it genuinely looks like to develop this capacity over time, even starting from a place where external dependency has been the pattern for as long as you can remember. Let's talk about what actually builds this specific kind of internally sourced worth, because understanding it exists is only useful if it comes with a genuine, practical path toward developing it, particularly for anyone starting from a place where external dependency has been the long-standing pattern rather than the exception. Here's the first requirement worth understanding precisely, because it's counterintuitive to how most people initially approach this work. The development of internal worth doesn't happen primarily through convincing yourself, intellectually, that you're worthy, repeating affirmations, or reasoning your way into confidence through logic alone. It happens through accumulated lived evidence, specific instances where you acted according to your own values, your own judgment, or your own genuine preferences, independent of whether that action received external approval, and then survived, intact, whatever response actually followed. Remember something we've traced throughout many other explorations in this entire series. Self-trust builds through repetition and accumulated proof, not through a single moment of decision or realization. This means the actual practical work involves deliberately, repeatedly practicing exactly this pattern, starting small, making a genuine choice based on your own values rather than anticipated approval, and then paying close, honest attention to what actually happens afterward. In most cases, what actually happens is considerably less catastrophic than the anticipatory fear suggested it would be, and this gap between feared consequence and actual, lived outcome becomes genuine evidence, accumulating slowly but genuinely, that your worth doesn't actually require the external confirmation you've spent so long believing it depended on. Let's talk about the second requirement, one that connects directly to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series. Deliberately, honestly examining and articulating your own actual values, distinct from values you've absorbed or performed in order to secure approval from specific people. This matters because internal worth requires something genuine to actually be internal to, and vague, borrowed, or performed values don't provide a stable enough foundation for genuine, internally generated confidence to actually take root. This requires real, honest reflection, sometimes uncomfortable, about what you actually believe, what you actually care about, and what kind of person you actually want to be. Separate from what's historically produced approval or avoided conflict in your specific relationships. Let's talk about the third and final requirement, one that ties together everything we've traced throughout this entire exploration into its most complete form. Deliberately, gradually diversifying the sources from which you draw connection, meaning, and validation so that your entire sense of being valued doesn't remain concentrated in any single relationship, including relationships with people who genuinely love you well. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding a portfolio approach to relationships, but it's worth understanding here as serving a specifically internal function as well as a protective one. When validation and meaning come from many different genuine sources, your relationship with your own worth naturally becomes less contingent on any single source's approval, gradually shifting the actual location where that worth gets generated from primarily external to genuinely increasingly internal. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that connects this specific topic to something considerably larger. This entire series has been building toward throughout its full, considerable length. The one thing a narcissist cannot control in an authentic person was never actually a special immunity, granted through some rare, innate quality unavailable to everyone else. It's the direct, achievable result of doing exactly the work this entire series has traced throughout dozens of explorations, rebuilding self-trust, releasing dependency on external validation, developing genuine clarity about your own values, diversifying your sources of connection and meaning. Every single piece of this entire series, everything we've explored together across this considerable body of work, has actually been building toward exactly this one thing, a genuine, stable, internally sourced sense of worth that simply doesn't have the specific vulnerability. Narcissistic control depends on locating and exploiting. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from this entire exploration, and genuinely, from everything this entire series has traced throughout its full length, let it be this. You were never actually required to become skilled at defending against every specific tactic, remembering every specific technique, anticipating every specific manipulation in real time for the rest of your life. You were meant to build, gradually and genuinely, the one thing that makes almost all of it structurally unable to work in the first place, a sense of your own worth that no longer requires anyone else's confirmation in order to feel entirely, permanently real. That construction, patient and considerable as it's been across everything we've traced together throughout this entire series, was always the actual, final destination. Everything else was simply the path that led you there.